Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. You're watching The Naturalist Capitalist, and I've got my friend Prince on the other end today. How's it going, Prince?
Good. How are you, Reed?
I'm doing great. It's good to have you on. I worked with Prince on Tulsi Gabbard's campaign. I met him 4 or 5 times in New Hampshire. We had a lot of fun. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about your political involvement, the history of your political involvement, and what your political philosophy is, kind of.
So I've been involved with the Democratic Party for years. Going back to high school. I've been active in volunteering. I've been part of local party chapters. Serving as highest president of local party chapters, and I was very involved with the Young Dems for a while. And I was actually vice chair of the Young Dems of Virginia at one point. I was a very loyal Democrat for a long time, to the point where, I used to tell a joke that it was worse to tell me I was a Republican than to say F you to me. I'm a JFK Democrat is the way I describe myself. I believe in, I believe in capitalism. I believe in very regulated capitalism. I'm not a socialist. I believe in opportunity over dependency, and I believe in personal freedoms and free speech. And I feel like, my old party that I've, since left after years of loyal, just kind of blind loyalty, no longer represent those values anymore.
Okay. Yeah. So, where do you think the Democratic Party went wrong? I mean, I know you were a Bernie supporter in 2016 and you were a Tulsi supporter this year. When do you think they went off the rails, and do you think there's any hope to regain that party, or do you think it's just kind of done and gone?
I think a lot of the spirit of the party was broken by Reagan. From FDR to Johnson, the Democrats were very open and very passionate about, about seeing the power of government and seeing how it can help people's lives. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment benefits, labor laws, etc. And, once we hit the Great Society and the overreach of government with welfare, and we started shifting from opportunity programs to dependency programs, especially multi-generational dependency programs, there started being a backlash. And you kind of saw that through the late 60s and the 70s with Nixon and even some rebellion against Carter. But when Reagan really kind of articulated, especially through his messages like, government isn't the solution to our problem, government is the problem. I think it really resonated with people. And you kind of saw this with the big shift of the Reagan Democrats, starting to vote Republican, and his massive landslide victories in the 80s. Democrats became very, very self-conscious and very afraid to really be who they used to be. They were afraid to be liberal. They were afraid to be open about the benefits of government and the benefits of regulating capitalism, and they just kind of surrendered. And so what you saw was, especially in 1992 going forward, was the new centrist Democrats, the Clintonites and whatever else, kind of saying, well, we can just be Republican light. This is what will win. And unfortunately for Democrats, all you need is one win, and they'll just take that to mean this is how you win everything, and they'll take the same model applied to everything, even if it's not accurate. So, coming back after 12 years of being out of the White House and seeing Clinton win by being Republican light, transformed the party into being a Republican light party going forward. And you kind of see that, more and more. The first few years of Clinton, they believed in things like universal health care. That was a disaster for the Clintons, and by 94, they lost the House for the first time in 40 years. And that just, reset them again and made them realize, well, wait. Or not really necessarily realize, but that kind of made them more self-cautious and caused them to pause and, just become even more Republican light, to the point by the end of Bill Clinton's term, he was governing like a Republican, deregulating the banks, welfare reform, tougher on crime. It was almost indistinguishable from Reagan, because this is the lesson they took from the losses that they had previously. And I don't think they've ever really kind of recovered from that. In large part because the same people who were around then are still around. Pelosi, Clinton, Schumer. They don't learn, they don't evolve with the times. They just remember what they've seen in the past, and they continue to project that into the future. And I think as long as they're around, the Democratic Party doesn't have a lot of hope, because they'll continue to stifle the party, and any hope or potential or any change that it needs will just continue to suffocate under their leadership.
So I think an issue that libertarians and progressives have with each other is defining their terms. So when a libertarian would hear you say, we need to regulate capitalism more than we do, that's going to set off a lot of alarms in their head. But I think it really comes down to defining what that means. So I would not say we have a deregulated economy. I think we have a very regulated economy, but it's predatory regulations. So you mentioned the bank, for example. So Glass-Steagall, when that was first enacted, the FDIC was created, which ensured all deposits from banks. The government was backing deposits up to give them security. But then when they overturned Glass-Steagall, they kept that provision in there. The FDIC still exists. Mm-hmm. That didn't go away with Glass-Steagall. So, what I would say is we should have repealed the entire thing, because what we've done is we have regulations that protect corporations, and they make it harder for the small businesses or the little guy to succeed. And a lot of these regulations, a lot of these corporations and banks and everything want some of these regulations kept in place because they can leverage them against us. So I would say we don't have a deregulated economy. We have a predatory regulated economy. What would you say to that?
So I definitely agree with the predatory regulatory economy. And so, one great example is like Hillary Clinton's bankruptcy bill in the early 2000s, when she was, following the banks, being a representative from New York, following the banks to make it harder for poor people to discharge credit card debt and other debt in bankruptcy. If you're a corporation, you can discharge anything. You can break any sort of union contract. You can do pretty much anything in bankruptcy that will benefit your corporation. But if you're a small person, you have the Democrats like Hillary Clinton leading the charge to make it harder for you to get out of debt, to make banks richer. And so, yeah, it's funny, you go back to the robber baron era of, the 19th century, even they didn't have rules that were so good for them as we do now, right, because they have both the Democrat and the Republicans working for them. So, yeah, you definitely have a lot of rules. And it's funny, there's a quote that reminds me of JFK used to say about how, 14 or 15 million Americans can pay someone in Washington to do their business and take care of their interests. For everyone else, you have the President of the United States, and he plans on doing his job. And what's sad is, the rich are paying both sides to do their business, and both sides are doing it now. If you look at the current campaign right now, Joe Biden's raised more money from Wall Street than Donald Trump. Who do you think he's going to be serving when he gets in? Both parties have had people, chairman of Goldman Sachs as their treasury secretaries. Both parties kind of have the same view on banking and really trickle down economics. And you don't really have this, capitalist, mom and pop entrepreneurship economics anymore. It's right, very much a very, rich centric trickle down economics of let's just help the rich. Let's, make sure that they're intact. Right. And, their benefit will trickle down. They keep the dollars, we'll get the cents, but everyone's benefiting a little bit. It is interesting, though. I will say I do the part. Mm-hmm. I do think Glass-Steagall was repealing Glass-Steagall was a terrible move. And for any of the viewers who don't know, what Glass-Steagall did was it separated investment banking from commercial banking. Right. And so essentially, investment banking is where you're trading in the stock market and taking on, risky investments, versus, more commercial banking is where you go and save your money in a bank. And now we have a system where they are merged together. So if a bank can take your savings and invest into very risky schemes, and it can bring down the whole system, which is what we saw in 2008.
Right.
And FDR tried to take care of that by breaking up the banks. What the FDIC does is it does protect small investors. Up to 250,000 of your savings and my savings is protected if the bank goes down. But what needs to happen is we do need to break up the banks. When I do say regulation, and this is stuff that even libertarians agree with, is like antitrust laws. When you have monopoly power, when you are too big to fail, that is anti-competitive. And libertarians were some of the strongest people to push for strong antitrust regulations. The Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, various things passed by Teddy Roosevelt and his successors. Because what we should have is a system where you should be small enough that if you want to take risks, you don't take mainstream money and take it down with you. And if you want to take a risk, you do it, you succeed, great. If you fail, and you don't take the economy down with you. And what we have now is we have a system where you have Citibank or JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or some of these other big banks, and they can take on risks. And they can, if they start failing, they actually have the U.S. economy and the U.S. people held hostage to bail them out at the cost of a huge financial collapse like we saw in 2008. And that hostage situation is something that both libertarians and progressives can agree with. Is a terrible situation to be in.
Right. So I want to just clarify what I meant with the FDIC. I think it's similar to student loans. The system we have right now is that the government guarantees a student loan, and that's been sold to us as though it's a good thing because you're secure in the loan that you're going to get. But what that does is that just enables the colleges to jack the prices as high as they want, and the student gets stuck with the loan. I think that's very similar to what happened with the banks, like you're talking about in 2008. All these accounts were insured, and the banks could be as reckless as they want, and they don't have any they don't have any repercussions for being stupid because they're bailed out by the government. Just like the colleges can charge as much as they want without without any repercussions because the government guarantees the loan, and then the kid gets stuck with the debt. So what a lot of progressives would say is, we need to get rid of the profit incentive there. We need to make college free, or we need to have public banking or whatever. It's not so much that I'm opposed to the concept. It's just that there's a lot of waste that's going to be induced there when we could solve the problem just by creating accountability through a freer market. So colleges, if we stopped guaranteeing student loans wouldn't cost as much because the colleges would have to drop their price. If we didn't have more regulations that were requiring people to have higher training for certain jobs that they don't need, they wouldn't have to go to school, they wouldn't have to get these licenses. And this has all worked in the past. It's not like this is a new phenomenon that we're struggling with. Like in the past, you didn't have to have all the licensing you do now. You didn't have to have all the degrees you did now. And the workplace was not, a terrifying place to navigate. We're acting like if we got rid of any of these regulations that everything would just fall apart and there'd be no accountability, where that isn't, the way things were 50 years ago. So I think we're on the same, you and I want the same thing. We want people to be able to get educated. We want people to have healthcare. We want people's banking to be secure. What I'm wondering is if even through different approaches, we could kind of come at it together in a coalition, because even though we have different approaches, we at least have the same goal, where the Republicans and the Democrats do not have the same goal in mind that we do. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. And so if I can take what you said and kind of draw it into kind of a philosophical perspective, I think essentially what we're both agreeing on is that, we do believe in a government that should help provide opportunities for people, but not reward undue risks, and right, especially risks that socialize the cost and privatize the benefits.
Right.
You saw with the financial crisis where we all had to pay in to save the banks.
Right.
If those risky investments had worked out, it's not like we're getting a cut of those investments. Those bankers are keeping those those risky investments.
Right.
But when things collapse, we have to come in and bail them out. And yeah, I mean, I do think it's something both progressives and libertarians, do agree on. So philosophically speaking, I do think there is a lot of overlap between progressives and libertarians. I do think both sides get maligned and demonized unjustly by having their viewpoints kind of skewed. Libertarians especially are seen as like Ayn Randian, let everyone die unless they can make it out of the Thunderdome. Where, in fact, I mean, there are I would say there are consistent philosophies. Individual freedoms. Both sides believe in things like legalizing marijuana and going as far as legalizing all drugs. And there's a number of reasons why that's beneficial, both from an individual freedom standpoint, from a safer aspect. I mean, you look at the heroin epidemic. The biggest issue isn't even heroin; it's the additives that go into the heroin that are killing people. And if you legalize and regulate it, you can have a much safer situation. People talk about the situation at the border and Mexico and immigrants. You legalize drugs. The biggest problem in Mexico are the drug cartels. You legalize drugs, you defund the cartels, and you stabilize Mexico and allow it to grow again. Once the economy starts growing, people won't feel as desperate and as necessary to come to the U.S. or to come to the U.S. It takes a lot of effort to travel hundreds of miles by foot or by donkey or hitchhiking or whatever these people have to do. They would rather stay if they can, but we make it hard for them. Legalizing drugs can, work on multiple levels. Inner city, a lot of inner city crime is based on, drug gangs and whatever else. You legalize, people trying to control territory. You legalize drugs, you defund these gangs, and you remove the incentive for all this violence going on in the inner city. So,
right.
That's something that both progressives and libertarians, and even, middle of the road, reasonable Americans believe in.
Right.
It's things that aren't beneficial to the parties. So it's interesting. You mentioned how you and I have a similar agenda, despite you being a libertarian and me being a progressive, and the two parties don't have a similar agenda to us.
Right.
But they do have a similar agenda to each other.
Correct.
And I think that scene that happened a couple weeks ago where Senator Feinstein hugged
Lindsey Graham.
Senator Graham, yeah, from Carolina. Essentially, that's what it really is. They like to, come to us, angry and fiery and talk about how terrible the other side is and how, one side's Satan and the other side's God and we have to destroy the other side and it's just black and white, good versus evil. But really, at the end of the day, in the lunchroom, behind closed doors, at the cocktail parties, these guys are sipping whiskey and drinking champagne together, pushing together a similar agenda that benefits them, but not benefiting us. It was the Democrats who helped the banks out by deregulating the banks. It was the Democrats who made bankruptcy harder for the average working person. It was the Democrats who, hand in hand with the Republicans, have pushed for more war after 8 years of Bush and saying war is terrible. They're the ones, adding billions of dollars to the military budget and, saying, yeah, it's fine to go into more countries and bomb more countries. When it comes to real issues, they're in lockstep. They'll come to us with abortion and gun control as, these are the distraction issues that we need to distract you about. And they're important issues, but they're a minor part of our day versus things like unemployment benefits and minimum wage and whether or not your kid's getting shipped off to war or various other things are more impactful to our day-to-day, where they're in lockstep, but they don't want us to see what they're really doing and how they're actually working together regardless. And it really doesn't matter who's in charge.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. So being a libertarian, I have dealt with like the frothy-mouthed and anarcho-capitalist, like extreme libertarians. And I mean, they'll even try to disown me sometimes because I'm not fanatical enough for them. Like I think things like national parks are cool, and I don't really have an issue with the post office. And, I can get excommunicated for saying things like that. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think dogmatism is good in any form. So there are libertarians who are opposed to like any government at all doing anything. But on the flip side, there are a lot of progressives, and I tend to think of more like the Bernie AOC supporting type of progressives, who are pretty much for any government control of anything having to do with the economy. Like no matter how invasive it is, they're all for it. What I noticed was the Tulsi Gabbard supporters. It was a kind of a different set of people. There were like just straight up libertarians like me supporting her, but even like the more progressive people who were in her camp, they were more open-minded. They didn't hate the idea of markets. They believed in like words like liberty weren't disgusting to them. But I'm not really looking for like a Ted Cruz, Bernie Sanders coalition here. I'm looking for people like you and me who can kind of think outside the box, and we realize that we have a common goal. Those are the type of people I'm trying to draw together. And I really saw that under her campaign, regardless of how small it was, for the first time. I'd never seen that many different types of people all getting in one room and talking to each other and going over ideas like that. And that was pretty cool.
Yeah. And I mean, and that was one of the great things about Tulsi. That was one of the things that attracted me to her, was how she kind of made that coalition. But what's interesting about that coalition is, I mean, when people take time to think and they're not just being fed party rhetoric, I would say what Tulsi represented was probably where 60% of the country sits. So like you said, you have the extreme, Ayn Rand libertarians, you have the communist, socialist, on the other side. But really, I would say, Tulsi was really kind of the middle mainstream. If anything, right. I think the whole left-right thing is kind of a poor, example to use, because it's kind of more 3D, or they always say how it kind of goes back into a circle. Where Tulsi sits is kind of where the mainstream is. Most of the country, I would say, on a high level, is socially moderate to socially liberal, and fiscally moderate to fiscally conservative. They don't care if gays are getting married. They don't care if you're smoking pot in your home. Most people do kind of are okay with individual liberties because they want their own liberties. So, right. Give me mine, I'll give you yours. They are also, wary of government to a certain extent. They don't want people to starve. They don't want people to be homeless, but they also don't want people being on welfare for 6 generations. And they don't want their taxpaying dollars going to waste. And so, there is that kind of sweet spot where I think 60% of the country sits, and essentially the two parties have kind of have them divided out. Right. The fiscal part was kind of pulled. People value one part more than the other depending on who they are. Those who value their money more have kind of been pulled to the Republicans. Those whose hearts bleed a little bit more have been pulled more to the Democrats. But really, they're part of a similar coalition, and versus the two parties are in their own coalition working against that, but just trying to keep them apart from uniting to rebel. And what's sad is what we have are two parties that are, their main focus is to prevent people from thinking as much as possible, and realizing where the overlaps are and where the differences really are. Because if they do, and if they realize it, they would have all been flocking to Tulsi's campaign. If for the people that did listen and that were willing to listen, 90% of them, I would say, really loved who she was and what she stood for. But it was those who were either just closed off to her because the girls on The View told them, "Oh, she's terrible," or right. Or they were just told by the Democratic Party, "Biden's our candidate, so he's the one you have to fall in line behind." People right. that weren't willing to take the time to think, the ones that keep getting lost in the wilderness, and are the ones that what Tulsi represents is what they represent. They just haven't taken the time to kind of break through and think for themselves to realize it. And sadly, unless someone, somewhat mainstream tells them, "Hey, look, this is the person you need to be listening to," I'm not sure how to break that.
Right. We talked yesterday, and something that you brought up that was interesting was the idea of programs that help everyone, that aren't targeted at specific races or genders or whatever. It's the idea of lifting everybody up. And I, even though I disagreed with him on a lot of stuff, I did like Andrew Yang because he sort of exemplified that spirit that you were just talking about of empowerment, not dependency. His whole shtick was the government's here to get you out of the ditch and then set you free. Like that was kind of what his whole message was. So there were there were some programs that I listened to Tulsi on, even though I wasn't 100% behind them. And the two programs that I thought made the most sense were her healthcare and UBI, because those are things that help everybody. She did have some other views like reparations and free college and a few other things like that I wasn't behind, because that's targeted at a specific group of people. And I think that there's a ton of complicated bureaucracy in getting there. My issue, though, with UBI and Medicare for All is not so much in the concept, it's in the actual implementation. So, for example, the CARES Act back in March, that was a one-time payment of $1,200 that was supposed to go out to everybody. And just seeing the massive shit show that was, they couldn't do it without cramming a ton of pork into it to go to the top, to all the corporations. And it took them forever to implement that one payment. So I have a problem with statism. I have a problem with bureaucracy and centralized government giving a lot of money and power to a centralized system that's supposed to disperse goods or wealth or whatever to a multitude of people. I really believe in decentralized government. I'm from New Hampshire, which has one of the largest governing bodies in the country, but it's very representative because every town is different, every county's different. Each town votes on what road they're going to pave. Each town has different fire permit restrictions, based on whether there's snow on the ground. So to me, the more decentralized something is, the more representative of the will of the people it is. So that's why I have, issues with Medicare for All or UBI being distributed by the federal government, because I just fear that it's going to be run by a small group of bureaucrats, and also that the disparity is going to be extreme when tried to, spread out over 300 million people. That's what my issues are with those types of things. So
I would say, that. Well, so with UBI, Milton Friedman first came up with the idea, I think, back in the 60s. And
right.
His perspective wasn't necessarily UBI as much as a negative income tax. So right. that, the government would pay you if you were at a certain level, if you were below a certain level, and then it would flip once you went above a certain level. But right. One of the big benefits of it was it didn't take away the incentive to earn. Like currently in our current welfare system, for every dollar you earn is a dollar you lose from welfare. Why right. work? Because you're working for free, essentially, for nothing, essentially, because you get that money anyways. In right. this system, most of what you earn, so you had an incentive to continue to earn and right. get your way off welfare. And I think, his system, I like, the theory of UBI was nice from Yang, and it's nice that he kind of made it more mainstream. Implementation-wise, I do think Milton Friedman's negative income tax is far more beneficial and far easier to implement. As far as universal standards or federal government standards, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. There are certain places where it is better to have a federal mandate or a federal standard. Weights and measures, for example. If you go to Texas or you go to Maine, 16 ounces being a pound is useful.
Right.
So I don't think it's a simple answer as in, not having federal regulation. There are certain places where it is useful to have a federal standard. Having 16 ounces be a pound in Texas or in Maine is very useful for people to, for transacting business back and forth. Having a minimum standard for clean water, clean air, anywhere you go in the country is useful for knowing that, you can go someplace anywhere in the country and be able to breathe or be able to drink water that's not tainted with lead. And, right now, we have those, Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and states can make stricter standards if they want. Like California has stricter standards than the national average. But having a minimal standard, I think, is useful. In that, FDA and pharmaceutical drugs having a basic standard of knowing that your drugs are safe. There are a number of things where it's just more efficient to do it on a federal level. But then on the flip side, yeah, there are certain places where locally is, local control is better. Two places I think that there should be more local considerations taken into account are things like minimum wage and taxes. Living in New York, making $250,000 a year barely makes you middle class.
Right.
If you're in Alabama making $250,000, you're probably the richest guy in your town in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when people talk about $15 minimum wage in New York, that's nothing. Most people do make more in Manhattan, and you kind of have to. That's nothing. But you go down to, Mississippi and, try to put $15 an hour, and you might be making more than, some of the, skilled labor down there, and probably more than a lot of the local business owners make themselves. So I do believe in a minimum standard, but I do think in a lot of local control should impact what the minimum wage should be. I mean, even within New York State, if you're up in Ithaca versus New York City, there's a huge cost of living difference between Manhattan and New York and Ithaca.
Right.
That, whether it's state control or city controlled, there should be, certain local control for certain issues like minimum wage. I do think for income tax brackets, it should be a factor as well. Because once again, I mean, if you're making $200,000 in New York, you're really not making that much. You're making $200,000 in Alabama, you're making a lot. And to have it taxed the same, when also factoring in the difference in cost of living, you're losing a lot more in New York with that tax rate. So there's a balance depending on what the issue is. Banking standards, a lot of these standards, I think it is useful to have uniform laws, uniform standards for conducting business throughout the country. But when it comes to like cost of living and how people, live their life, there should be, some local input. If anything, there should at least be a minimum standard for a lot of areas. Even education, I think there should be a minimum standard of, this is what math is. We can't have a school system teaching people 2 + 2 is 5, and just have a whole system of uneducated people. There should be a minimum standard of 2 + 2 is 4, so that everyone has the opportunity to achieve their potential.
Yeah. So in theory, I 100% agree with that. I mean, I think that's what the government's role is to, basically protect us. And through protecting us, I think forcing transparency is one of its roles that it should have. Like, I think if you are going to sell food, you should have to show what is in your food. I think the concept of the EPA is great. I think the concepts of a lot of these things are really important. What is unfortunate is they end up. Go ahead.
Okay, I'd say you might actually be taking the more progressive view on that, and I would actually have the more libertarian view on that. I don't think government is there to protect us. I don't think government should be paternalistic. I do think government should be there to inform us. I think the most important thing government can do is provide transparency, like what is in our food, what is in our drugs, are they safe? But I do think, and this is, I would say, my libertarian streak, it's up to us to decide whether or not we take what we do with that information.
Oh, absolutely.
The government give us, they should be there to bring, whether it's organic labeling or whatever else. They should be there to provide us as much information as possible. But if we decide, hey, we want to go out and we want to smoke pot, the government shouldn't be there to protect us, saying, no, you can't smoke pot, or you shouldn't have a cigarette. There should be restrictions like protecting others from what we do. I want to smoke a cigarette. The person at a restaurant next to me shouldn't have to suffer secondhand smoke from me. But if I want to smoke a cigarette, that should be my right. The government's job should be to educate me and provide me information, not to indoctrinate me and control my habits. So,
no.
Go ahead.
I certainly agree with that. I mean, I think that if you put rat poison in your food, you should have to have a label saying it's there. But if you want to eat that food that says it has rat poison in it, go for it. I mean, so we're on the same page there. What I was going to say though is the problem. Almost all of these departments, they end up fulfilling the opposite purpose, and they get bought out by corporations or special interest groups to protect them and screw us over. So, for example, the oil spill in the Gulf, Exxon should that was Exxon, right, in the Gulf? Yeah, Exxon should have gone out of business.
It was BP.
BP, that's right. Sorry, BP should have gone out of business, but they were protected by the EPA. There was a cap put on how much they could be sued. The EPA kind of gives a lot of businesses a license to pollute, and they get away with it. So it seems like the more and more bureaucracy we add on, the less and less transparent it becomes. So I am for, basic regulations, but I think they need to be really basic, and they need to be very hard to taint in the opposite direction. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's what's more. Go ahead.
If I can summarize, philosophically speaking, you should be able to pursue actions, but you're supposed to be responsible for the actions you take. And right. I agree. BP, and I think progressives would agree as well. BP should be responsible for the actions that they took. What I think the problem is a more fundamental level of corruption. So, what you have, I think one of the biggest problems we have, and this is something both parties are guilty of, is this revolving door between private corporation and government agencies.
Right.
So right now, there's kind of a wink-nod relationship between a lot of agencies and the private sector. So if you work for the FDA, or let's say you work for the EPA or the Department of Interior, I guess, regulating offshore drilling sites. If you're a little guy, a couple years out of college, there's like a wink-nod relationship where you give us a couple of good years of reviews, and a couple of years we'll give you $150,000 a year job working for us, and it's perfectly legal. What's interesting is, our criminal politicians have defined the corruption rules to benefit them the most. They'll write these long regulations, making like, look, this thing's 3 inches thick. We can't be corrupt because look how thick it is.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of fluff with a lot of loopholes that they use to enrich themselves. And so, right now, if you take a bribe when you're on a job, that's corruption. You can be prosecuted for it. But if you accept a bribe after you've quit your government job, that's perfectly acceptable because you're no longer a government employee.
Yeah.
So here you are making $50,000 a year. You have this carrot being dangled in front of you about making 3 times as much. Of course you're going to kind of play ball, and a lot of them do. And this is exactly what happened with Deep Horizon. Was a lot of these, the inspector was just kind of signing off, with the promise of this job, even though it was a poorly run facility. And because the government is complicit, the government is sort of responsible because they should have never signed off on the drilling site. Yeah, they'll protect these corporations because a lot of people are dependent on this corruption. And you see this even, it's gotten so bad and so corrupt. Like it's almost comical how bad it is. This revolving door between the private sector and government, or between politics and private sector, shouldn't be where it is. And I think the time it really, really struck me was in 2016 during the presidential primary, when Debbie Wasserman Schultz resigned in disgrace for helping Hillary cheat in the primary.
Right.
And she went from disgraced politician resigning from the DNC to Hillary Clinton co-chair. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was how Donna Brazile went from CNN analyst to DNC chairwoman. And that revolving door between the media and the political parties is most disgusting. When people talk about, JFK gave a very famous speech about the importance of the free press and how the First Amendment is the First Amendment for a reason, because without a free press and free speech, democracy is impossible. Without educated populace, and without free speech, an educated populace is impossible, which you need to run a democracy. And you have parties that are incredibly beholden, you have media that's incredibly beholden to the parties, and this revolving door relationship is very dangerous. When you can go back and forth between DNC chair and CNN analysts and back, of course, most of the time you're going to have a positive opinion of your old boss unless something really crummy happened, with the hope of being hired back like Donna Brazile did. And you're going to kind of favor and pander back and forth, building up that relationship to the point where, as bad as Fox News is, I would say CNN is worse right now. MSN is worse right now, covering it for the Democrats. And there's no such thing as objective news anymore in the country, because everything is this money-driven, power-hungry, incestuous relationship. And it's really crazy right now. And it's really killing us. The first thing we need to really do is break these relationships. We really need to make a rule where, if you work for, if you're a government employee, there are restrictions on what jobs you can take for up to 5 years after you leave the government.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be restrictions between the relationships between the media and the political parties. And, there need to be regulation on big tech and the media, because we don't have real information. Look at all the disinformation going on right now. Look at the censorship going on by the big four media conglomerates and any information that doesn't agree with the agenda they want to push. And it's borderline totalitarian.
Yeah, once business becomes an extension of the government, that's terrifying, and that's what big tech companies have become. They've become an extension of the government, and they give backdoor access to all of our search history and all these other things that the government can take. So they basically are the government. The argument that they're a private company is becoming kind of void because they're interchangeable. I think
do you know a great example of when that was true, when government and business were the same?
What's that?
Dark Ages Europe, serfdom. Your lord was your political leader. He was also your boss on the plantation, telling you what to grow, how to grow it, and how much you owed him. Your economic and your political life all ran through the same person, the same system. And you're right, we're running into that system. And we saw little bits of that in the late 19th century with like coal towns. When you weren't paid in US dollar or in gold, you were paid in company script. You lived in the company town, you're paid in company money, and the company essentially owned you. And thankfully, we had leaders like Teddy Roosevelt who came and broke that up. FDR continued to break that up. And sadly, those progressive movements have been tampered down for the corporate movements, which, once again, both parties are beholden to. And we're seeing that merger between political power and capitalist power realigning to kind of put us back into being serfs for the powerful.
Right. Yeah, so to me, we really need a wall between business and state in a lot of ways, and I think it's a two-way street. So, a lot of people only talk about campaign finance reform. I don't think that's enough. I think it's got to go both ways. The reason, all these corporations are lobbying politicians is because they can pass laws that have so much control over the economy and can give them such a hedge against their competition. That's why they lobby them. That's why we have things like the Jones Act, and we have intellectual property laws, things like that make it impossible for anyone to compete against a government-mandated monopoly. So to me, it's both ways, and unfortunately, you only hear libertarians talking about one half and progressives about the other. This is really an issue I think they need to come together and say, look, you can't buy the government off, and the government needs to have less control over the economy because it can, that's why there's this revolving door of money.
Absolutely. If you look at one thing that's disgusting to me is how the two presidents that have made the most money off the presidency are the Obamas and the Clintons.
Right.
Not Republican presidents, but two presidents from the Democratic Party, which claims to be the party of the people.
Right.
I remember watching the Al Smith dinner back in 2000, where Al Gore and George Bush both spoke, and George Bush got up and it's an annual dinner in New York that raised tons of money from very wealthy people. And George Bush got up amongst the crowd and he was like, "People call you the elite. I call you my base." Yeah, everyone laughed. And it was funny, but it was true. I mean, at least the Republicans, they haven't been shy about it. They're the business of corporations. They're the business. They're the party of big business. They're pretty open about it. They're the party of the rich. The Democrats, though, they will come to you and tell you they are the people's party. They are here for the little guy, and they will use the party to enrich themselves. The Obamas and Clintons were worth maybe $1 million going in. Now they're 100 millionaires because of the presidency. They're passing laws like government surveillance. They're sending your kids off to war. They're making it harder for you to get out of debt. But saying that they're your buddy, they're here for you, while really just trying to enrich themselves. One thing that's interesting is I spent a little bit of time in Wall Street, and one thing I can tell you about rich people is rich people don't give money away; they invest. Part of the reason they wear $5,000 Rolexes is that the price of a Rolex goes up over time. It's an investment. It's a nice showpiece, but it's an investment. Everything they do, they're looking to gain value from. Do you think they're giving Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden $15 million because they like them? No, they're investing. With Hillary, it's probably payback for Glass-Steagall and for helping them already with what she's done for them. And who do you think she's going to serve if she ever made it into the presidency? The people who bought her off. But it's not corruption because it happened before she was president. It's speaking fees. Crap like that needs to go away. The Obama's the same way. It's like, oh, you were so great to us for 8 years. Here's your reward for being our puppet. And coming out, he was worth $200 million. Those things are bribes. The system doesn't define them as bribes, but they are bribes. And things like that need to be tampered down so that, these politicians no longer have that incentive to screw the American people for their own personal benefit.
Yeah.
And that's what both can agree upon. And that's where, what's interesting is a lot of what we're talking about, the mainstream American agrees with. Right. Unfortunately, they're constantly distracted with, Trump's a Nazi and Biden's a communist and abortion guns. They don't have an opportunity to get into the meat and potatoes of what these issues are and really look at things. One issue I was talking to someone recently about, and I think most Americans would agree with this, is voting. We're on the cusp of an election. Voting's, here already. And you have the whole thing about Democrats being like, let everyone vote, no voter ID laws. And the Republicans are like, well, we need to make sure only citizens are voting. Let's have voter ID laws. And what's interesting is I think both sides have some points, but both sides are wrong. If Democrats really cared, they should be pushing. They should be okay with voter ID laws. Unless you don't really want, unless you want non-citizens voting. What they should be pushing for is universal IDs. Right. You can't cash a check. Yeah. You're not a person without an ID in this country. You can't cash a check. You can't go into a bar. You can't do anything. You can't even get a job without identification. You can't do anything without identification. And why Democrats are pushing for, some people don't have IDs, and therefore we should be okay with that. No, you should be pushing for everyone to have an ID because you're not a person without an ID. If a poor country like India can get 1.2 billion Indians an identification card, why can't a rich country like the U.S. get 340 million Americans identification card? And so the two parties actually wanted to do, if they actually wanted to resolve an issue, and it's a very easy issue to resolve, they would just get together and say, okay, we agree with your ID, we will give you voter ID rules, you give us universal identification. But it's much easier, it's much more useful to kind of wave it as a red flag of look, they hate voting, look, they love illegals, and keep that as a distraction away from each other, then we get together and solve this in 15 minutes with the solution that, and just put it away. And part of it is neither party really has any real ideas of what to do in the future. So all they can really do is just constantly fall back on the few ideas they have and just use it as flags to distract us from the fact that they're really doing nothing to benefit us at all, and they haven't for a generation.
No, absolutely. I thought that Tulsi was about as reasonable as a person could have been in the Democratic 2020 primary because it was a pretty unreasonable scenario to be in. if she were not a Democrat, if she would leave that party and run an independent candidacy or libertarian or whatever, I think she would be so much better. What I was really hoping that Jesse Ventura was going to run, because he is a guy who was a Ron Paul supporter, a Gary Johnson supporter, a Jill Stein supporter, and was going to run in the Green Party. And he had views from all over the place. You know, he said, "Oh, I'm fiscally conservative, I'm socially liberal, but, you know, universal health care is a good idea, but I think you should be allowed to own machine guns." You know, I mean, he was just like all over the place. And his message was just the two-party system has sucked us dry and we need something else. And, you know, I was willing, whatever disagreements I might have with him, I didn't care. I was like, okay, I will get behind this movement if it happens, and then it didn't happen. I want to see something like that next time. You know, the election's on Tuesday. I recommend people go vote third party just to boost them, get them over the threshold. But I think the day after the election, we need to start talking about a coalition, and with a lowercase libertarian coalition. So people from the right and left who believe in personal liberty, who want the government to be accountable to us, and who want to overthrow this corporatocracy that we have. And I want them to have conversations like you and I just had here, and realize that they really do agree on a lot. And if they put the partisanship away and the labels away, we could really come up with something that could threaten the two-party system in 4 years or 8 years or whenever it is. And I would love to see Tulsi Gabbard be part of that movement, but I think we also need someone from the right. You know, I used to think it would be Rand Paul, but he has kind of made his bed with the Republicans. I don't think he can do it anymore. He's kind of a little bit too polarizing. But I would like, you know, I really like Justin Amash. To me, he kind of represents Tulsi Gabbard from the other side. Even, I mean, they disagree on some things, but they're very principled. They both listen to anyone talk. They were both blackballed by their own parties, and he actually left. He's not a Republican anymore. You know, I would love to see a ticket like that with one person from the left, one person from the right, who are decent and reasonable and can talk with each other, try to lead a movement to just destroy the incumbent monopoly that we have, because that is undoubtedly the largest threat to our freedom and our republic. You know, I mean, I feel like we can talk about the other issues later. The most important thing is getting them run out of town on a rail. What do you think?
So, I mean, I agree with you. And one thing I find sad is how, you know, what our primary system does, and this applies to both parties, is it's not designed to find the best candidate. It's designed to weed out reasonableness and essentially pull in the biggest party hack you can find and make them the nominee. And so, like Tulsi, like you said, was the most reasonable Democrat running, and the Democrats hated her for it. You know, one Republican I really appreciate, really like, is John Huntsman. Mm-hmm. And John Huntsman is a moderate, moderate Republican, former governor to Utah, ambassador to multiple countries under both Republican and Democratic presidents. And, you know, in 2012, he ran for president. And at one point, he got up on, you know, he was on the stage for the debate, and he said something along the lines about, you know, it was a question about climate change. And he said something along the lines about, I believe in science. And he got booed by the audience.
Sounds about right.
You know, John Huntsman is, I mean, I've met him in person. He's, you know, he's a very charismatic person. He's very intelligent. He's very thoughtful. He has a very Kennedy-esque presence to him. And he's someone that a lot of people, when if they get the chance to know him, can really be drawn to. But like Tulsi, he was demonized by his own party, right, because he was a threat to the powers that be that control the party. And so it's sad because, you know, you have people in power that know they don't deserve to be in power, but will do anything they can to stay in power, which also means destroying, you know, any potential leadership that's better than them, you know, and hurting the country by depriving them of that leadership. You know, but what I would love, going back to your coalition, is maybe like a John Huntsman, Tulsi Gabbard coalition. You know, especially, you know, with the wealth that the Huntsmans bring. You know, let's be honest, you need wealth to kind of break through, you know, the message machine that you have here. And Ross Perot did it with his money back in the 90s. That I think someone like, you get a coalition of like Jesse Ventura, Huntsman, Tulsi Gabbard. You can get some of the more progressive people like, Dennis Kucinich, in a strong anti-war message. Rand Paul, and even, Marco Rubio, who's still kind of a mainstream Republican. He started breaking away from like the hardcore Republican mantra and starting, taking on more populist and progressive aspects to his policies. I think you can start peeling people away. But I think the big thing is, to quote, George H.W. Bush, is, the big mo. There needs to be momentum. And I think that was one of the things that Simon Tulsi was the media constantly saying she's not going anywhere. Biden's our guy. Biden's our guy. And despite the fact that even today, 3 days before the election, there's no enthusiasm for Biden. People were spoon-fed this false narrative and they bought it. There does need to be, some, control of the messaging so that people can see that what they find reasonable is possible, instead of constantly being like, what's reasonable is impossible, so you have to vote for what's unreasonable. And I think that's where third parties have failed. It's a combination of that and, the inability to work together. Having met, talked to, some third party leaders, unfortunately politics is, involves a lot of egos. And you always have someone who's in charge of some third party or another that doesn't want to step aside for the good of the many. They'd rather be the standard bearer and having their name on the ballot and having the glory for a day than doing what's good for the group. And that's the other problem I think we've seen with third parties is they won't work together because it's like, I want my name on the ballot. I want the glory. I want, the recognition. And instead of saying, I'm going to put my ego aside for the greater good, you put your ego aside for the greater good, and let's come together. So, there's lots of different progressive movements I've seen. And why isn't there just one unified progressive movement? Different people are like, this sounds like a good idea, but I think I should be in charge. Same thing with the libertarian movement. This sounds like a good idea. I think I should be in charge. And like you and I have just seen, all the progressive groups, all libertarian groups, and then those groups, themselves should be coming together into one unified third-party movement. But they won't until someone who's a little bit larger than life, or at least larger than them, will step in and take that risk and do it. But I do think there are people out there, people who've served in, statewide positions and, other positions that may be able to do it, but it's a big risk. It does risk, your position in your own party. It does risk any, if it's a win, it's huge. If you lose, you could be done politically. And we need someone with courage willing to do it.
Yeah. Well, I guess the last thing I want to ask you is what is your outlook for Tuesday? What do you think is going to happen? Do you think Trump's going to take it back again, or do you think Biden's going to win?
I think it's hard to say. I think one factor a lot of people haven't thought about is the impact of COVID, and not just the response and people's reaction to the response, but how it's actually had a big migration impact on the country. I live here in New York, and in New York City, they say about 600,000 to 1 million New Yorkers have left New York, potentially permanently, and they've gone to states like Florida and Georgia and North Carolina. New York votes 85% Democrat. So imagine, 600 to 1 million people, 600,000 to 1 million people, of which 80% are Democrats, going to a state like Florida, which was won by, I believe, about 100,000 votes in 2016. You had 200,000 Democratic voters, and you can start swinging these states for Biden. So I definitely think the electoral math and the polls, are benefiting Biden clearly, but Trump has surprised us before. And, based on, what I've seen from this campaign, there's a lot of pressure from the left. There's a lot of shaming. There's a lot of demonizing. There's a lot of canceling. There is a lot of, destructive rhetoric coming from the left that I wouldn't be surprised if there is a silent majority out there that of Trump supporters who are just afraid to admit that they support Trump because, the media is so anti-Trump that they will go into the booth and, support Trump, even though they vocally will say, oh yeah, I'm pro-Biden. So I can see it going either way. I would, if I was to put money on it, I would say Biden, just because of the demographic shifts and the migration shifts, especially from places like New York and California over the last 6 months. But I would not be shocked if Trump was able to take it.
Yeah. Well, we'll have you back on the show again, and after the election, we'll have to be working on this coalition. So we'll have to have more conversations. Thanks for coming on, man. It was a great conversation. We'll have you back for sure.
Awesome. And thank you for having me. And I look forward to coming back.